Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for jumping in so late in Summit. I know it's been high energy right throughout, and you've joined us for this session, so we promise to make it as high impact and interesting as we possibly can. What we'll be talking about today is doubling the capacity of your data platform without doubling the cost. And as a place to start, I thought it'd be helpful to give a little bit of an introduction to myself and to Tyler. My name's Gavin Edgley. I lead the value team at Databricks here in the US, and I have the pleasure of working with a whole host of Databricks customers and telling the story of the impact they're able to drive with Databricks. And that's the capacity through which I got to meet Tyler. Back before the pandemic, we started describing the impact that he was making as he was migrating from Hadoop to the cloud with Databricks. And if I'm honest, since I met Tyler, I've told some of his stories, the same stories that you'll see in this presentation, 10s, 50, 100 times. These are some of my favorite stories, so I'm really pleased that we're able to bring them to you today as evidence of how you can really kind of get a hold not only on costs of your data platform, but also on making sure that you get as much impact from your data teams as possible. Tyler, for your intro, over to you.
Hello. I lead the platform engineering team at Scribd. We'll talk more about what Scribd is, but I wanted to share a little bit about what platform engineering does at Scribd. And we build and maintain the data and ML platform at Scribd. Scribd is very data-oriented, and our data platform is, I think, what a lot of you would expect in terms of storage and compute to enable users to run queries, launch Spark jobs, things like that. But our ML platform is where we enable a lot of our internal users to develop, I would say, train, deploy, experiment with, and validate models and some of our machine learning use cases. We actually started working with Databricks in late 2019. I'm very impressed by Gavin because he volunteered to join us for an offsite in Toronto in January of 2020. And so I can't imagine a more enjoyable place to be in January than Toronto. But we really moved from our on-premise infrastructure into AWS in 2020 and finished that up in early 2021. And so a lot of the things that we've learned along the way have come from, I'd say, real live production use cases of moving a massive, massive data platform supporting hundreds of users with petabytes of data into AWS without, I would say, burning through all our cache. Scribd also, I am very proud that we invested in and helped build the Delta RS project and Kafka Delta Ingest project. And so we're also very big investors in the Delta Lake community and some of these things around Databricks from an open source perspective as well.
Magic. All right, perfect. So that's the two of us. There are essentially three things that we'll be covering throughout the talk today. The first one is kind of linking the work that Tyler and his team does through to Scribd's overall mission. And I think this is sometimes something that can be overlooked among other data organizations and data platform teams in particular. But Tyler's done a great job of kind of making that link and calling out what I believe, which is that his team is absolutely essential to Scribd's overall success.
I agree.
You agree? Perfect. We're on the same page. The second piece is around removing barriers for engineers. So when I say some of those stories that I share with other customers come from the experience that Tyler has shared with me, this is one of those big ones. I won't spoil it here, but there are some things that him and his team have done quite differently that I think are really good lessons that other teams could adopt. And then finally, there's this last piece around optimizing the actual cost of your infrastructure, whether that's the AWS bill and the compute or services like Databricks. There are some really good practical tips here on what this actually means and how you can make sure you communicate that through your organization.
Yeah, one of the things I think everybody that moves into the cloud learns very quickly is that everything has a price and it starts to stack up a lot. And so when we first moved into AWS, we knew we were going to be basically paying a premium for our inexperience. And now that we've developed some of that experience, there's some things that I'm looking forward to sharing on how we keep track of this and keep it sane.
Absolutely. Let's dive into that first piece, shall we?
Yeah, so at its core, Scribd's key mission is to change the way the world reads. And what this means from a practical standpoint is we've pulled together a lot of audiobooks, books, documents, very, I would say, mixed types of media to bring information, bring educational content, bring news and current events content to our users, and bring that all together in one platform. At the core of this, we have a tremendous amount of data. Scribd is a data-oriented company, for sure. And when I joined in early 2019, we had on-premise Hadoop infrastructure that had been, I actually couldn't tell you when it was actually launched. Like, we're very early adopters of some Hadoop and early data infrastructure, and it had been key to the organization for a long time. When I think about how data is really driving what we do at Scribd, it really comes down to understanding from my perspective. One of the things that Scribd did early on is we were a document hosting site. And so users would upload documents into Scribd, and like Flickr at the time and some other companies for photos, you would then share that document with others and embed it. For us, we have this massive, massive corpus of documents, and it's quite a challenge to tell people or to understand for ourselves what's actually in those documents. What are they about? Who are the entities? Who are the people? Who are the places in those documents in order to make really interesting relations between them to present our users with something interesting? And on top of that, we have to understand what users are actually interested in, or where to take users, or where to show users new content. And so really, data is driving this key understanding of both our corpus, but also how users interact with corpus, or interact with the corpus, in order to do something novel and interesting that's going to be enjoyable for users and really drive more reading behavior, more encountering of new content, and things like that.
I'd never heard the word corpus before I'd worked with Tyler. My understanding, it's a whole heap of content. Is that kind of fair for a layman?
Yeah, it is a whole heap of content. We will sometimes talk about being one of the world's largest digital libraries. And I don't like to think about Scribd as a library, because we all have preconceived notions of what a library is and what you do at a library and how you interact with things at a library. Scribd is something different entirely, because we have so many different types of things that you can tie together, from articles to books to audiobooks to documents, in really interesting ways. So it's not quite a library, but I'll talk about corpuses in terms of where the stuff lives. When I think about how the data platform impacts Scribd, we actually have a lot of different users of data, because we are very data oriented. And I'll focus more on some of how data impacts these different teams in a moment. But for the platform engineering team, data is really how we're helping our internal users surface interesting content for users, understanding what's in the corpus, and then understanding how our users are using it. But we're not actually doing a lot of that. Our job is to deliver the platform, the tools, the building blocks. We're not necessarily writing queries. We're not necessarily doing all the model training. We're not doing any of the model training. But our job is to understand how all of these other teams are using the data and ML platform in order to succeed in Scribd's core mission. Gesundheit. So I want to talk a little bit about how we've removed some of our barriers for engineers. And when I first joined Scribd, our data platform was on-premise. And because it was on-premise, it wasn't very accessible to a lot of people. And we also had a lot of misunderstanding about what the data platform was and what the move to the cloud was going to entail. So we, very early on, asked people inside of Scribd engineering how much they thought our infrastructure cost. Big honkin' Hadoop infrastructure, lots of HDFS, lots of really big beefy machines. What was actually driving our cost there, and how much did we spend on it? And one of the big things that I learned, and if you go through this sort of exercise with engineers at your respective organizations, I'm sure you will learn as well, is that engineers, myself included, don't necessarily have the best intuition on how much infrastructure actually costs. What drives those costs, particularly in AWS, as you get into AWS, GCP, or Azure, becomes a lot more opaque to engineers. And so there can be some misunderstanding on where we spend money and how that affects our business.
I'd say that it comes from a really good place. It comes from the place where engineers are thinking, this is expensive. I want to make sure I optimize queries in order to reduce costs for my organization. And that's such a logical place to go. And that's why I find this so eye-opening, to kind of have this conversation and say, how much do you think this actually costs us? And then to kind of do your contrast, which is coming up next, I think is so helpful.
Yeah, one of the things that engineers, myself included, will definitely do is if you give us a metric to optimize, we will optimize against that metric. And when we hook up, observability tools to data infrastructure, we'll see, well, we've got a certain amount of disk usage, or we've got jobs that are taking a certain amount of time, and we can optimize the shit out of those, which may or may not be something that is actually valuable for the organization. And so I wanted to spend some time talking with engineers about how much they thought we actually cost, because my time is incredibly valuable to me, and engineers that I work with are incredibly valuable. I want them to be working on something that's going to help users read and consume content in new and interesting ways. And so we started to ask people, well, what do you think your time is worth? What do you think the opportunity cost of us optimizing disk usage or something else like that is going to look like? And what I actually learned as I started to work more with the finance team is our infrastructure cost was less than half. I can't give you exact numbers for obvious reasons, but it was nothing like our people cost. And so we spent an edge all hands, and I think we actually did this in a company all hands as well, trying to educate people that you people, all of us here, you are much more valuable to the organization than EC2 instances or things in AWS. And so what that means for us is that, it changes our behavior a little bit. It changes how we talk about Gavin's favorite word, value.
I love that
of what we're doing with the data platform or what we're doing with the ML platform. And it means that our time as people in the organization is our most valued asset. Because if you're spending time fighting with infrastructure, or if you're spending time sitting around waiting for queries to complete, that is time that we don't spend coming up with new ideas, trying out new prototypes, or doing something ultimately more valuable as an investment for the organization. And for my team, the second bullet is one of the big lessons that I learned is that the more things that I can remove from the way, from somebody like Gavin. Garen's another Databricks guy we work with a lot. The more I can remove those barriers, the faster they can get their stuff done on the data platform, and they'll ultimately do something more interesting for the business.
This is one of those things, these Tylerisms that I've now shared with many, many other customers to work out, does this hold true elsewhere? Does this kind of insight actually mean things to engineering teams? And so I have had the opportunity to share it time and time again, and I found that the aha moment is really, really consistent. If you can, I'd love to help you if that would be helpful in your organization to build a tailored view of this exact picture and work out how it changes behavior. I think if you were just looking at the infrastructure cost side, you might spend a lot more time optimizing queries. If you just thought about people costs, it might drive a negative behavior, but here you can actually get a sense of the relative spend, and that means that you can actually kind of prioritize your effort appropriately and make sure you're hitting the mark.
One of the things that I found, I would say, enjoyable as a thought exercise with some of the people in the organization when we shared a slide similar to this is asking people whether they thought they were overhead to the business or innovating for the business. And anybody you ask is going, I think we all want to be innovating. We don't want to be considered overhead for a lot of reasons. But when you get to people to that, like, well, I want to be innovating case, well, then you ask, well, why would you obsess over hosting costs? Like, your time is an investment in the business. So let's get you innovating, doing something interesting as quickly as possible. And it changes that mindset around how we view cloud infrastructure, where you can get sticker shock from how much it costs to do things on Databricks or on any other cloud-based data platform, to think more about, well, what am I unlocking for people? But of course, at the end of the day, money is real and we have to care about these costs. So it doesn't mean we ignore them entirely, but they become a secondary concern. And they typically, for a team like mine, become one of our more interesting concerns.
So then you did something completely radical that I hadn't heard of anywhere else, and you just pulled out all the stops and did something different. Please tell us what you did.
So Databricks' pricing model is usage-based. A lot of enterprise software that I have purchased is user-based. Databricks wasn't user-based pricing, and so I said, screw it, let's give everybody some Databricks. I loves me some data, I hope y'all love you some data, let's give everybody some data. And what we ended up doing was when we moved from our on-premise infrastructure into the cloud, is we moved a read-only version of our data from HDFS into Delta Lake and S3, and then we slapped some Databricks on it and opened up notebooks to people, and basically gave it to everybody in Okta. And all of a sudden, like overnight, within the span of a couple of weeks, we had people exploring data and interacting with it in a way that we had never seen before. I had people in the customer support organization, I had people in marketing, I had people that I didn't know were my customers as a data, owner of the data platform, coming up to me and asking me questions about what they could do with our data sets that were going to change how they interacted with the product, with customers, or even with other teams inside of Scribd. And that was interesting. I did not expect that. This was like a beneficial side effect of me just saying like, I loves data, you loves data, let's all have some.
I would have thought, just based on that point, it feels, again, I share all this stuff all the time, and the typical reaction I get from other customers is, well, wait a minute, that's going to cost a hell of a lot if you just open this up to everybody. And so I'm very curious. I think you have something that'll follow on what the cost is, but then also, I'm also curious, I'm kind of asking on behalf of the group, what problems did they solve? I think there's both sides that are helpful for us to understand, because this is really exciting what you did.
Take customer support, for example. Like customer support, it's not like we just had people showing up and being like, I'm going to play in data and that's going to be fun. Everybody loves writing SQL queries. What ended up happening was a lot of people started to come up with interesting usages for data to drive decisions inside of their organization. And so customer support, I use that very intentionally because that's one of my favorite use cases because I didn't expect them to be one of my customers. But we worked with the customer support team to start ingesting like Zendesk data. There's a couple other products we use to really understand how successful is customer support being, like how satisfied are our customers with the responses that they're getting or the ticket volumes as they come in. We have some KPIs that we assign to customer support and they're key, very important to the business, how well customer support is doing. All of a sudden, customer support folks were popping out of the woodwork trying to figure out how they can analyze that data, how they can learn more about how users are interacting with Scribd before they hit customer support, and then once they hit customer support, how successful are we being there? And when you give everybody access to the data, you then get this really interesting, or at least we did, and I hope you would all replicate this, you get this really interesting behavior where people start to ask questions that you didn't expect them to ask because it's there and it's easily accessible. And it's not that everybody in customer support is writing Spark SQL queries. Let me be clear. There's a couple of key champions in all of these teams that are outside of engineering that were interested enough to spend some time with my team or spend some time going through the Databricks training to learn a little bit, get some notebooks created, and then share those internally. So within Scribd, I would say, I was talking with Gavin about this a couple days ago. I don't like it when people talk about technical and non-technical people. We are a technology company. Everybody at Scribd is technical. And I would assume that's the same for most everybody else's companies here. The question is, how familiar are they with the tools of the data platform? What we ended up seeing is a lot of people would have one champion in a team would create a notebook and then use widgets, or people would copy and paste, tweak queries a little bit to get their answers, even if they weren't necessarily capable of creating a notebook from scratch or executing some of the queries that they needed to execute. And so everybody's writing and running notebooks, which is a terrifying thought for so many reasons, because I don't know how many people have kids or were kids at one point that read If You Give a Mouse a Cookie or If You Give a Mouse a Muffin, also a good book. But once you give a mouse a cookie, the mouse is going to want a cup of milk. And the story goes on and on and on. The mouse wants more, right? And so once we gave people a little bit, they wanted more and more and more and more. And so I started to have this big question mark in my own head of well, I've opened Pandora's box. I'm now responsible for this cloud cost. What's going to happen? And so we started to use some of the features that were available then in Databricks. Databricks has actually added a lot more since we started using Databricks on how we can manage the cost and prevent users from just doing things that were crazy expensive unnecessarily. And so one of the key things that we've done is we provision shared clusters, we being platform engineering, and we maintain those. We decide what the right sizing is, what the right budget is going to be for those clusters, and those are generally available for our users. Once you step outside of those interactive clusters that are shared and managed by us, we've implemented cluster policies which say, yo, I'm going to let you launch your cluster, but here's the fixed parameters in which you can launch this cluster, which helps us make sure that somebody doesn't make a mistake and ask for, let's say, 1,000 worker nodes as opposed to 100 or 10. So cluster policies are a really useful way to do that. We also started to introduce a couple of shared instance profiles, which are a security mechanism to give people effectively read-only access. There's no possible way for someone to write to our production data lake because everything's restricted to read-only for these ad hoc or interactive use cases. And we also do some other things from platform engineering to help guide and encourage people to make the right decisions. And from I would say philosophical standpoint, if you want to enable people in the organization, you have to trust them and you have to extend that trust, but you still kind of behind the scenes have to have like a hard limit somewhere. And so we had this two-pronged approach of we're going to encourage people to make the right decisions, but if they make the wrong decisions, there's something that's going to prevent them from doing something, incorrect that's going to cost us a lot of money.
Again, when I don't have Tyler next to me and I'm explaining this great concept to another customer, one of the pushbacks I often see is they just feel like they are handing out their credit card to random people in the organization without these controls, and that's a nightmare. You wouldn't want to do that. But I think the way you described it, Tyler, the thing that really jumps out to me is it's not just a free-for-all. You've empowered people to solve these problems, but you put some guardrails on. So they're not going to write to your production data lake. They're not going to be able to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are some boundaries, but you've given them the freedom, because I think what I most commonly see is people asking for permission. People have to ask for permission from the platform team to get access. That puts up all kinds of barriers, which means maybe the customer support use case may never have emerged.
Yeah. So if you're asking for permission, that means you have to know that you're going to use the data platform to solve a problem.
Yep.
If you don't have to ask for permission, you open up all of these like exploratory, I wonder if I could do this type use cases, and that to me is something particularly exciting, because at no company does innovation live in engineering alone or product alone. It's spread across the organization. And so what we started to see were really interesting use cases coming out of this model of, let's just allow people access and give them the guardrails and trust that they're going to do the right thing and find the right valuable thing for the organization to do. And these are a couple of the things that I saw at Scribd that I didn't necessarily expect, that I thought were pretty stinking cool. My favorite, as someone who is in an operational capacity, was starting to see notebooks used and our data sets used in incident response. If you're not in an operational capacity, the way that we measure things is kind of, assessing impact, like how many users are affected, how does it affect revenue, things like that. And then mean time to response and mean time to resolution. And I started to see incident channels getting created with these incidents that would happen, and people sharing Databricks notebooks using some of the real-time data sets that we had deployed to figure out in real time how many users are being affected and how, by bugs that were deployed or external service providers that had problems, or like US East 1 is on fire and blah, 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 blah. The other thing, and this is a little bit more of a conventional use case, I think, but I started to see real-time data in notebooks being used for validating features. And this is where I really think about like unlocking value, to do my best, Gavin.
Great word.
Unlocking some value in the organization is, if I can get a product manager an answer in an hour, a statistically valuable answer on whether a feature is good or bad, then that means I can change the weighting of an N-way test or an A/B test in an hour, as opposed to after the night's 24-hour run, we'll do a big batch report, and then tomorrow the product manager can make a decision. So all of a sudden, users were able to start making decisions, particularly product users, start making decisions in a time frame that was way shorter than it was before, which meant you could roll something out in the morning, make a decision, and maybe tweak it before the end of the day in a business day, which was really cool. The last one is something that is particularly interesting to me because it's a newer feature in Databricks. If you're not familiar with Databricks SQL, I'm sure there's plenty of people downstairs who would love to tell you all about it. But there's alerting in Databricks SQL. And so I started to see some users setting up alerts on our data for finding these really wacky edge cases, particularly with some mobile devices where you've got, let's say on Android, a bazillion different devices of different SKUs, and these really needle in a haystack problems would show up, and using alerting on our data sets to figure out when these are happening and on what versions to really drive their own quality assurance processes. And none of these were the plan. The plan was I needed some Databricks to run some jobs because we're getting off of Hadoop. And so by opening things up, all of a sudden new use cases popped up and acceleration, or the use of the data platform accelerated. Which brings us to this. All of a sudden everybody's loving them some Databricks, using lots of Databricks, and of course using lots of AWS in the process. And my job is to make sure that the checkbook doesn't catch fire and that we're not spending we're not losing our value.
Good thinking. Yeah,
by
makes
spending
sense.
so much. So I wanted to offer a couple of tips. These are things that I've learned and had to sort of figure out as we've moved into the cloud. We can look at things basically from two perspectives. The AWS perspective and the Databricks perspective. The AWS perspective, you got Cost Explorer and budgets to really manage this, but those only get you so much if you have a noisy or a bad data set. And so we've got a couple of tags here that we started to standardize across everything. Owner would be who launched the workload. Content understanding, that team launched the workload. Department is what finance, what budget does that fall under. But the second two were things that we actually added this year that have given us like way more insight into what the hell's actually going on with our costs. We launch everything with Airflow, so we've got Task ID and DAG ID. So our Airflow operators will tag every single job that we submit to Databricks with the name of the task that was submitted. And then Databricks, when it provisions the AWS workloads, will add that tag onto it. So with Task ID, I can take, summarize daily user analytics. This is a made-up task name. I can go look in Cost Explorer and see exactly how much that task is costing every single day. And then, because budgets will support tags, I can also set up a budget to say, this is only supposed to cost $10 a day or whatever it is. If it costs more than that, then someone's getting an email or someone's getting a Slack alert or something like that. And so by baking Task ID automatically into our Airflow operators, every single task in the data platform now has a cost associated with it, and we can start to do modeling around that. But in our case, we have hundreds of tasks across many different DAGs. And so we also added DAG ID, which means I can look at groupings of tasks together and say, one of our DAGs is just MySQL data ingestion. So we pull data in from MySQL, we copy some into Delta Lake from MySQL. And so I can look at the cost of that entire DAG as things progress, week on week or day on day, however. And having those two tags, and if you go to reInvent and look at any like AWS costs optimization talk, it basically always comes down to tags. Just tag everything. And then you can use AWS's tools to really start to understand the cost of that. This is not something Databricks does for you. Databricks will happily pass those tags along, but you have to do the work in your own code to make sure that you have the raw material to do some interesting cost optimization work from an AWS perspective.
Just in case you're wondering at this point, I don't know, Tyler's talking about something I'm a little bit less familiar with. I asked some more technical folks at Databricks as to, how does Scribd's tagging compare to other Databricks customers? You're among like gold standard. And I think the interesting thing here is what you can actually do with those insights later down the track is the most powerful piece. I'm so glad to hear that you can kind of share it so clearly, but this is one of those keys to being able to manage and understand costs.
Yeah. And it's like I mentioned Airflow, whatever job orchestration tool you're using doesn't really matter. Just wherever things get launched, throw some tags on it, throw some consistent tags on it. And then on the AWS side, you have to say this is a cost attribution tag. And that's all you have to really do to start seeing it in Cost Explorer and budgets. But that'll give you the insight you need to understand things from the AWS perspective. From the Databricks perspective, it gets a lot more interesting really quickly. Recently, Databricks introduced usage log delivery, or usage logs at the account level, so you can go see how much things are costing. But with usage log delivery, they drop some things into an S3 bucket, some JSON files, hourly, daily, I don't really remember. And that will have basically a ledger of this user launched this type of workspace with a Photon, interactive, whatever SKU that was, how many machine hours it was, how much it actually cost, and some other attributes that go along with it. And it's an incredibly rich data set. And I love rich data sets. And with that data, I can then start to look at how much particular workloads are costing on the Databricks side, so how many DPUs are being used. And by pulling in some of the cost data from AWS and then pulling in this usage log delivery things, I can get the total cost of every workload in the data platform and start to do interesting things with it. Because it's all just data in Databricks, right? Like, what those users were doing with Databricks SQL to set up alerts, I can set up alerts on DBU usage now because I have usage logs being ingested into Delta Lake for us. And it's a very, very rich data set, and I highly recommend it. Really enjoyable to play with. The second tool that we deployed is much more interesting from an engineering, like a strictly engineering standpoint, in that Overwatch is a tool. It's available in the Databricks Labs GitHub repository. And it's source available. It does not have an OSI approved open source license. That's a conversation for later. But we've deployed it. We worked with Databricks to deploy it. I'm hoping at some point they consider it part of their product suite because it's a really awesome tool. And it basically gives us really deep insights into what's happening with our workloads running on the Databricks platform. So Overwatch is like analyzing logs coming off of the Spark cluster to figure out what's your actual utilization of disk, what's your actual utilization of CPU memory, and a bunch of other things. It's an incredibly rich data set. And that allows us to set up dashboards to see where we've got workloads that are, I would say, incorrectly provisioned. So AWS and the usage log delivery won't tell you if you've got basically 50% more resource than you need to run a Spark job. Overwatch data will tell you that. And so by pulling together that cost data up here and then really rich utilization data from Overwatch, we can start to make really interesting recommendations to our internal customers and developers of jobs or queries in a way that we otherwise couldn't do. So we've got a bunch of data from AWS, we've got a bunch of data from Databricks, and then Overwatch gives us the really rich bottoms-up data from the actual clusters and query engines themselves. And we can tie that together from a platform engineering standpoint to say, here's where we have inefficiencies, let's systematically improve those. And so one of the ways that this is manifested for us is we, instead of like with these cluster policies that I mentioned earlier, like instead of just guessing at what the right cluster policies are, we can put the right defaults in based on real world usage for our users to make sure they get what they need. It also helped us decide whether we should adopt Photon, but also where we adopt Photon. I have heard Databricks people say that Photon will accelerate all of your data workloads. Not exactly. It will accelerate most of your data workloads, and it is faster and cheaper for most data workloads, but there are some where it just doesn't. And that's okay, it's going to get better. I firmly believe that Photon is the right choice for a lot of things, but I now have the data to prove here's where Photon is going to improve our cost profile for certain jobs, or most jobs, and here's where it's not. It also helped us build the business case for Databricks SQL and SQL Serverless, yeah, SQL Serverless is what it's called. I'm never sure in the order. And so we were able to identify workloads that we could just rip away from AWS and just put in serverless because we had that full picture on where things were costing us money and where it didn't make sense to spin up Spark clusters just to run these jobs or just to run simple queries. And with all of this data, I have a very clear picture of what's happening. And if you roll out usage log delivery, start tagging the hell out of everything, and go so far as to deploy Overwatch, you will have an incredibly rich picture of what's going on in the data platform. And it's important, and I really urge you all to assume best intentions from your users, because there's not been a single case where we've seen something over-provisioned or costing a lot of money where someone meant to do that. It's almost always a mistake or a misunderstanding. And that assuming best intentions has allowed us to collaborate really tightly with these developer teams to make sure that, hey, you're spending a lot of money here. Tell me, help me understand why. If that's what we need to do to solve this problem for the business, great. That's what we have money for. We invest this in the business. If it's like, oh, I just done goofed and I configured my Sparks wrong, then let's help you fix it. And so we're able to do that from platform engineering, which has helped us quite a bit with managing and optimizing our cloud costs.
So if you've got, I'm going to skip this last bit because if you've got any burning questions, they're probably going to be for Tyler. I'm not going to be offended. I would love to leave a couple of minutes to do just that. The thing I'd leave you with is I think Tyler is absolutely brilliant at making the link between the work that his team does and Scribd's overall mission. I find it's really common for data platform folks to really focus on number 3. It's clear he's an expert in number 3 as well. But being able to do numbers 1 and 2 as well, I think is a real differentiator for a leading engineering team. So if you're looking to build a similar story like this, please reach out. I'd love to lend a hand, and I'd love to open up if there are any questions.
I know many things. So does Gavin. Go
Please.
Thanks. Great talk. That was wonderful. Well, I guess what is Overwatch? Can you talk about that more? The question is basically what is it exactly? Is that like Grafana, just
So
slap on your cluster and then that?
there is a Grafana floating around for the recording in case it wasn't picked up. Is a question like, what the hell exactly is Overwatch? So there's a Grafana front end that gets deployed, but there's really a couple of collectors that you deploy that are picking up execution plans and logs off of clusters in your Databricks environment. And what we really get at the end of this is these collectors are dumping data into Delta tables. And so the Grafana stuff gets built on top of that, but really what we get is a bunch of Delta tables with a lot of data. And so Gavin pulled this picture because it's pretty and I can't show you anything from inside of Scribd, but really at the end of the day, just like with usage log delivery, you get a really rich data set, and if you loves you some data, then you can start to do really interesting things with that data set.
Stuff like what's running in your clusters right now as opposed to like a way to marry cost and AWS cost together.
Yeah, there's nothing about cost in there. It's all about compute or compute memory disk, et cetera, utilization, or how that query plan is being applied across the cluster. So you can get a good understanding of whether you're, say, running all of your workloads on drivers as opposed to actually using the nodes you've attached as worker nodes. We've probably spent a significant portion, I can't say exactly, but we spent a lot of time this year really setting up Overwatch, which once you get it all running, it works beautifully. And then digging through the data. I've probably had a couple of engineers working for the past month, just really digging through and understanding the data, because what we're doing is not looking for one job is broken, this job is broken. We're looking for these patterns across all of the jobs. And once you've got that data in Delta, then you can start to really do some pattern matching and interesting heuristics based off of it.
There's a separate session at Data and AI Summit that focuses just on Overwatch. It happened, I think it was yesterday, but if you look back at the on-demand, you can go in detail. It's a 45-minute session just on that piece.
It's very cool. It's worth your time.
Absolutely. No dramas. I know we're over time. If there are any other questions, happy to. One more? Go for it.
Yeah. So the questions are like opening up Databricks notebooks to everybody. What's the governance story? How do you prevent chaos with that? So there's a couple of things that we can do with that. And one is everybody has read-only access, so no one's creating derivative data sets without going through existing change management processes, which helps a little bit. The second thing, which I don't really talk about here, and we're interested to follow more of the Unity work that Databricks is doing, but we actually manage a lot of that, like who actually has access to what at the catalog level. So we have multiple catalogs. We use AWS Glue currently. We have multiple catalogs, and some of these shared clusters have different catalogs associated with them. And then at the Databricks level, we have permissions model that Gavin and I might have access to the general clusters, but he might have special access to clusters with different catalogs attached. And so it's, I would say, rudimentary. I think Unity, if the dream is real, I think Unity is going to make for a much richer governance model than what we're able to do today with Glue and Databricks. So simple to begin with, which for us at the time was the right call. And as the organization has been maturing, Unity starts to look a lot more interesting and a more fine-grained governance model.
Perfect. Thank you for the questions. I think we're about to get the hook, but thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. Enjoy Summit.
Thank you.